The Kepler 442b Agricultural Council chamber buzzed with the usual cacophony of alien voices, the melodic chirping of the Avari delegates, the deep rumbling tones of the Thrakari representatives, and the crystalline chimes of the Zephyrian observers. At the center of it all sat Marcus Chen, the only human on the council, his weathered hands folded calmly on the polished biometal table. "The human proposes dirt farming," scoffed Veltar, the lead Thrakari agriculturalist, his forearms gesticulating dramatically, "while we have perfected hydroponic matrices that yield 17 times the output per cubic meter. He wants to play in the mud like his primitive ancestors." A cascade of agreeable sounds rippled through the chamber. The Avari representative, Kesha, ruffled her iridescent feathers. "The humans' methods are quaint, but this is the 28th century. We have evolved beyond such crude techniques." Marcus had heard it all before. 3 years ago, when the colony ship New Horizons had arrived at Kepler 442b, he'd been assigned a modest plot of land on the outskirts of New Geneva, the kind of real estate nobody wanted. Rocky, apparently infertile soil that the automated geological surveys had deemed agriculturally suboptimal. The other species had claimed the fertile valleys with their precision-engineered growing facilities, leaving humans with what they considered scraps. "Gentle beings," Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the chatter with surprising authority. "I've submitted my quarterly reports. My yields speak for themselves." Veltar's mandibles clicked in what passed for laughter among his species. "Yes, we've seen your quaint vegetables. Adequate for feeding a few dozen humans, perhaps, but hardly sufficient for serious agricultural planning." The Zephyrian delegate, a crystalline being whose name translated roughly to harmony of starlight, chimed in with metallic resonance. "The human's emotional attachment to archaic methods clouds logical assessment. Our biosynthesizers can produce nutritionally perfect sustenance without the variables of weather, soil composition, or seasonal cycles." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. He'd learned not to argue with them directly. Aliens, he'd discovered, rarely changed their minds through confrontation. Instead, he'd spent 3 years quietly working his land, experimenting, adapting, and most importantly, learning. The meeting continued with discussions of quarterly output goals and resource allocation. Marcus listened but contributed little, knowing his voice carried minimal weight among species that measured agricultural success purely in terms of caloric output per unit of energy invested. 6 months later, disaster struck. The colony's primary fusion reactor developed a catastrophic coolant leak, contaminating the main agricultural district. Overnight, the Thrakari hydroponic facilities withered and died, their delicate nutrient solutions poisoned beyond recovery. The Avari aerial gardens, dependent on the reactor's energy output, went dark. The Zephyrian biosynthesizers, requiring massive amounts of power, shut down one by one. Within a week, New Geneva faced its first true famine. Marcus stood in his fields as the emergency council convened via HoloLink. Around him, row upon row of vegetables grew in defiant abundance. Tomatoes hanging heavy on the vine, corn stalks swaying in the alien breeze, potato plants with their precious tubers hidden safely underground. His crops had never depended on the reactor. They drew their energy from the local star, their nutrients from the soil he'd spent 3 years carefully composing with compost, crop rotation, and what the other species dismissively called primitive intuition. "The situation is dire," Veltar announced, his usually confident voice strained. "Our food reserves will last perhaps 3 weeks. Repair estimates for the reactor range from 6 to 8 months. The nearest supply ship won't arrive for 4 months, added Kesha, her melodic voice now sharp with worry. We need alternatives. Harmony of Starlight's chimes had lost their musical quality, becoming harsh and discordant. Emergency rationing protocols are insufficient. Even with perfect conservation, we face a 30% population loss. The silence stretched uncomfortably before Marcus cleared his throat. I believe I can help. Veltar's image flickered on the holo display, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence. Human Marcus, your small farm cannot possibly— Not just my farm, Marcus interrupted gently. Give me authorization to expand operations and I can feed the colony. The laughter that followed was bitter, tinged with desperation. Your dirt farming cannot scale to our needs, Kesha protested. We require precision, efficiency. You require food, Marcus said simply. and I can provide it. 3 days later, Marcus stood before the assembled colony leadership, not as a minor agricultural footnote, but as their potential salvation. He'd prepared his presentation carefully, knowing he'd get only one chance. Soil-based agriculture isn't primitive, he began, his words echoing in the packed chamber. It's anti-fragile. Your systems were optimized for efficiency, but they had no resilience. They depended on centralized power, purified nutrients, controlled environments. When those failed, everything collapsed. He gestured to the holographic displays showing his yield data. My crops grow in conditions your systems would consider chaotic. Variable weather, unfiltered sunlight, living soil full of billions of microorganisms. That's not a weakness, it's a strength. My plants adapt. They survive. They thrive in uncertainty. Veltar leaned forward, his skepticism evident but tempered by desperation. Even if your methods work, scaling them would take months we don't have. Marcus smiled. That's where you're wrong. Humans have been perfecting intensive farming techniques for thousands of years. Victory gardens, urban farming, permaculture. We can turn every available space into productive farmland within weeks. The transformation that followed would become legendary in the colony's history. Marcus didn't just plant crops, he taught an entire civilization how to work with their hands, how to read the subtle signs of plant health, how to build living systems that sustained themselves. Thrakari used their forearms to excel at harvesting and planting. Avari utilized their flight capability to tend vertical gardens and tree fruits. Even the Zephyrians learned to appreciate the complex chemistry of composting. Within 2 months, New Geneva had more food than it had ever produced at peak efficiency. The colony not only survived but thrived, developing a robust, distributed agricultural system that could weather any future crisis. On the day the new reactor came online, the Emergency Council convened one final time. The chamber was different now. The biometal table was surrounded by planters full of fresh herbs, and each delegate wore the slight smudges of honest soil on their appendages. The humans' methods proved adequate, Veltar admitted, though his tone suggested the understatement was intentional. Marcus chuckled, running his dirt-stained fingers through a sprig of basil. Sometimes the old ways persist for a reason. Sometimes what looks primitive is just proven. As the other delegates filed out, already planning their next planting cycles, Marcus remained behind. Through the chamber's transparent walls, he could see the colony stretching toward the horizon, no longer a sterile collection of gleaming towers, but a living community where alien architecture grew alongside human vegetables, where efficiency had learned to dance with resilience. The human farmer had not just fed a starving colony. He had taught an entire civilization that sometimes the simplest solutions were the strongest ones.